Welcome everyone. We're just going to get started in a few minutes. All right, welcome everyone to our seminar on young women and COVID. So excited to be here. My name's Maddie. I'm from the Working Women's Centre, which is a non-government organisation that provides advice and representation to vulnerable workers about their rights at work. So we're hosting this seminar today because we know that young women have been particularly badly impacted by the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the industries that have been particularly badly impacted or shut down are industries where a lot of young women work, like hospitality and tourism. A lot of the young women that have been working throughout COVID have been on the front lines in education and healthcare and other sectors that have really been having to had extra pressure during this time. And we're particularly worried as well about what the long-term impact of COVID will be on young women's employment. So super excited to have a great group of young women in front of me to talk about this issue. And before we just get started, I just want to acknowledge that wherever we're tuning in from on this continent, we're on stolen Aboriginal land. For me and probably most of us, I'm on the land of the Kaurna people. And so on behalf of the Working Women's Centre and the guest speakers, I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and future. Maybe if you're somewhere else, feel free to comment which traditional lands you are on in the comments. And I'd just like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Amongst some other things, tonight we're going to be talking a bit about unemployment and underemployment for young women. And I would just like to note that young Aboriginal people are kept out of the workforce at much higher rates still. So just to bear in mind that when we're talking about employment and COVID, that the impacts of COVID has not impacted all young women equally. So I'm really keen to get stuck into hearing from our speakers. First, we're going to hear from Alison Pennington, and then we'll hear from a panel a bit later of young women talking about their personal experiences with COVID. But first, I just want to encourage you all throughout this webinar to use the chat function, post comments in there, and also the Q&A. If you have any questions, we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end. So feel free to put any questions in there. In fact, to get us used to using the comments, I want to ask you all to put a comment in there about what has a small silver lining of COVID been for you. So it could be something small like you discovered a new hobby or a snack or something. I think for me it was getting back into reading again because I wasn't spending so much time at the pub. So what's something small that has been a good thing that's come out of COVID for you before we get stuck into all the bad things? Sleep-ins, more time to practice piano, more time with my toddler. Love it. And once we've heard from Alison, I am going to ask if for people who want to share if you've been impacted by COVID and how it has impacted you in your working life. So I'm just warning you now so that you can have a bit of time to think about it while she's talking. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Alison. So Alison Pennington is a senior economist at the Centre for Future Work. She's associated with the Australia Institute. So we're super lucky to have her talk tonight. She does research on economic issues facing working people. And Alison is all about using economics to make life better and more meaningful for working people. So I'll hand it over to you, Alison, to talk to us a little bit about how young women have been impacted by COVID in work.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and it's an absolute pleasure. I love doing stuff for women's organisations, but definitely for the Working Women's Centre as a South Australian who's grown up, born and bred in the western suburbs of Adelaide. There's a silver lining. I'm very lucky to be in work, but a silver lining for me is reconnecting with the flute. I used to play flute in school. It's just sitting right next to me, and my singing and piano stuff. I've been getting into my music way more, and we can thank public school music education at Woodville Primary School, Woodville High, for that. So look, guys, I've just done a whole bunch of research recently on how this crisis is impacting women, but I also do a lot of work on youth. So this work my little prezzo will be bringing together a bit of a story about what's happening. And it's mostly one of, in major crises, economic crises, young people are generally the group who do the worst because they haven't got a full foot into the labour market yet. So when employers start shedding jobs and cutting people, they often cut young people first, the junior roles first, or they stop hiring, obviously, and as businesses go under, they're obviously not hiring. But then what's interesting about and horrible about this crisis is that typically recessions have impacted male-dominated and male sectors of industries, and then it sort of broadens out from there. But what's unique about this crisis is it is disproportionately impacting women because of the fact that they've been in those customer-facing, often more insecure and low-paid roles. But it's shut down all those customer-facing industries, as Maddie was outlining at the start. And so that's the little run up to it. I'm going to share a few slides, and I'm going to have to move through them quite quickly and cover a lot of content. But if I go 1 or 2 minutes over, I'm hoping that people will be kind to me on that front. So here are the slides, and I believe that should be all good to go. So this COVID era jobs crisis we're in, I've got this tip of the iceberg picture here because the official unemployment is obviously not a full measure of the scale of this crisis. These are the most recent stats. So we've got 922,000 people formally unemployed, but a much higher rate of unemployment for young people, 14.3% compared to 6.8%. But then if we add on those who worked fewer hours or no hours at all, that's another 975,000. 180,000 people have left the labour market altogether. And so if you bring all those numbers together, we're looking at 2.1 million Australians, or about 15% of the labour force is an effective unemployment rate. So you can see that's much higher and much more concerning than we would hear in the mainstream media or even from the government when they say we've got this rebound happening. The gendered impacts of this story, though, of course, we had this perfect storm that happened. We had those customer-facing sectors. Once we realised we had to stop contagion, those ones were shut down first, and they are female-dominated, particularly young people and young female-dominated areas like hospitality, retail, tourism, the arts. So at the same time as the labour market was shutting down jobs for women, at the same time, the caring burden totally exploded across the country, and we had families that had to suddenly homeschool, look after elderly family members, and look after each other in general, because, you know, not just childcare centres closed, but also schools. And at the same time as all that was happening, then the recession starts to unfurl. And as businesses start pulling their investments, they start cutting jobs. The first jobs that go are the insecure ones, and women dominate in those roles. So this is the perfect storm. Since February, we've seen a decline of women's employment by 3.4% compared to 2.9% for men. And 56% of women's jobs that have been lost have been full-time, which is totally disproportionate to how many full-time jobs they had before coming in, which is only 36%. So that's a very worrying sign that looks like women have been first to be cut, or their caring demands have exploded and they've lost their full-time jobs entirely. There's been some recovery since May, and that's why you'll hear people talk about a rebound, but 88% of those jobs on the rebound have been part-time. And at the same time, we've got this in decreasing aggregate demand, which is we're going to see more layoffs as this unfurls. Then we have all these social issues arising, and there's some really concerning research showing in surveys that have been done during the pandemic that show 1 out of 10 Australian women are reporting experiences of abuse or harassment from current or former partners. And over half of those people are saying this is becoming more frequent or more severe than before. And a lot of people are reporting incidents where there weren't incidents happening before. So this is what happens in major economic crises. Pressure comes on the households, and it's manifests in this way. So the government's responses, of course, haven't been adequate. They've been making it, I would say, far worse. Of course, it's great we've got the introduction of the job seeker payment, but there are a few different ways that government has shaped these policies that has made it worse for women. So at the start, the JobKeeper wage subsidy, in its design, over 1 million short-term casuals were cut out of that. And those were, and migrant workers too, and those people were in the most affected industries. So those industries shut down, none of those jobs were saved. And this new September 2-tiered payment, which will be introduced, is actually going to cut the payments back for everyone who was on part-time jobs. And so disproportionately part-time workers coming into the crisis are women and young women. So this is going to bake in lower incomes and lower hours for women long-term. The childcare supports were cut, so women had to cut their hours. It's another policy that had a bad impact on women. The upcoming cut to job seeker of $300 a fortnight will disproportionately hurt women, because there are more women on this payment. There are more, the people most at risk in this group of people on the supplement are older women and women with caring responsibilities, so particularly single mothers. I've equated that $137 million will be lost more than what men will lose from that cut. So it's a disproportionate cut. Then we had public sector wage freezes, minimum wage freezes in female-dominated sectors. Governments put money into bloke-heavy industries like construction, not a lot, not enough, but only in that area. And that's the problem, it's only going there. At the same time as they're introducing tax cuts, which are going to be helping the upper income earners, which are disproportionately older men. And then for young women, what has government brought to the table? They keep talking about JobMaker, but JobMaker is basically anything they want to spin as PR, they throw under this banner of JobMaker. There's not much coming and not enough money being spent and no jobs generating plans. And then at the same time, they're not providing any pathways for young women into work. They're jacking up the price of university education, and they're not providing any relief in the vocational education sector, any serious reform. So that overall picture is the way in which government's making it worse. I've got here just to say, at the same time as this crisis is happening, part of the story, of course, for women is, we know it was bad before COVID hit, right? Things were not looking good, and young people know this especially. Not just systematic disadvantage in the jobs market, but we have this increasing privatized education skills system. So you go there to get skills, you end up paying more, less access. You deal with a punitive welfare system. If you're not in work, then you're dealing with an increasingly disciplinary, grind of a bureaucratic experience, jumping through hoops to look for jobs that don't exist. Private housing market, there's a crisis happening in the provision of affordable housing. And then at the same time, whatever's left at the end of your paycheck is going to basically 2 or 3 companies that run our food production and utilities. And if it makes it worse, we're also dealing with climate change. So this is nothing new, right? The young workers have been systematically disadvantaged in the labour market pre-COVID. I found that there are 600,000 young people who are not engaged in full-time work or education in 2018. This is before the crisis. 600,000, that's a pretty good indication that there was a problem before. And the reason why young people have been doing worse is because they are most vulnerable to a business-heavy labour deregulation agenda to cut wages, make labour cheaper, and make people more insecure, because that makes more money for business. That's basically it. It's just to increase profits. And at the same time, our unions have been facing, attack after attack and have been unable to build in this time. We've seen the explosion of unfair and illegal practices like wage theft, of which young women are disproportionately experiencing, and then over a weakening system of minimum wages. But at the same time, all this is happening, of course, education rates have been increasing. This is 20 to 34-year-olds. People are getting more degrees, but there's less and less full-time work. And I show this because it's to say that this was before the GFC. Like the GFC was actually the time when things started to decline for young women in terms of access to good jobs. This is for both genders, this graph. And so what's happening is that employers have stopped hiring. They stopped hiring after the GFC because they were competing on how much they could make out of wages, rather than hiring new people, investing in new people, thinking long term, training up and recruiting. And that's the overall neoliberal environment we've been in. It's the no strings tax cuts, money in the back pockets of businesses on the pretext that they're going to spend it, but they don't. And at the same time, the public sector is being totally cut back. And the public sector is where a lot of young people get their first foot into the door. That's where a lot of jobs pathways were very secure in the past. Hopefully I'm relatively within my time, is to say, well, this is why, based on this this clear double crisis that young women face, both as women and as young workers, what is the future? What is the possibilities of being able to land decent, secure work and build a career and have some sense of stability and security. And it's quite clear that this can't happen within the status quo. This can't happen in the current framework. And what we need is something proportionate to or similar to the 1940s, when we had coming out of the war, and we looked back over our shoulder at the Depression, and we said we don't want to go back into 10 years of stagnation and high unemployment, and a whole generation was lost. We don't want to go back there. And so what we need is a public reconstruction, sustained reconstruction effort across all policy areas. And this has to be led by government and led by public investment. And we have all of the resources and the capacity to do it, and plenty of people who want to be a part of building a better Australia. And so some of the key elements that I would put forward in a jobs generating agenda for women, a national agenda that also ensures that women are included in that process of reconstruction, is immediate measures first to ease the poverty of women who are most at risk now, and ensure their safety. So we need DV leave, 10 days DV leave. We need paid pandemic leave. There are hundreds of thousands of women workers in healthcare system and social services who have no access to sick leave right now, and their health and safety is at risk. And we need to bring the job seeker payment back to its original rate, the coronavirus supplement, sorry. And then we need to invest in the social infrastructure of the economy. It's not just about building and constructions. We need that, but we also need to start seeing feminized industries and feminized work and social industries as part of the infrastructure of the economy, and good jobs too. That's childcare, aged care, vocational education, community services. Young women need free education, because to navigate this crisis, they need to have access to good quality skills that are fully accessible, and they can't be expected to take on debts in an environment like this. TAFE has to be put back to the centre, and we have to abolish fees in the university sector. Childcare has to be free. Free universal public childcare is very standard across many advanced economies. Australia is very far behind. We need to be funding our renewable transition, deal with the housing crisis. We need to commit to a sustained program of non-market public housing development. There's no way that people can continue to see this very overheated market and constant asset price continue to rise. And finally, we want to give women the tools to win these things, because we can't expect that any of the current, forces and politicians that are currently around, or with our very weak level of organisation as working women, that we're going to be able to get these things unless we fight for it and we have the capacity to do it. And in that regard, we definitely need mass industrial relations reform, so that women can actually participate in their workplaces, bargain collectively, bargain across their sectors, come up with plans for their sectors, and implement them. So that's my my slapdash analysis of what's happening and what we need to move forward, I think. Thanks.
Wow, thanks so much, Alison, for fitting so much in such a short amount of time. I think definitely all the things you've spoken about are things that have really been reflected in what the women that come to the Working Women's Centre tell us about what they're experiencing. So we've had a lot of women who've not been able to access JobKeeper or other payments, and so job losses have hit particularly hard for women who are in casual, insecure work. And really love your plan for reconstruction. I think that's exactly what we need. So I'm now going to pose a question to the audience, just to answer in the comments. Maybe there's something that sort of rang true to you from what Alison said. How have you been impacted by COVID? So pop answers in the chat. I know it's a pretty big question.
I can put something in because no one's said anything. Like the isolation and trying to, I live alone, so I think the work from home development is something completely new for psychology and working psychology, and the impacts of isolation and the need to produce work from your homes, the mixing of your home with your workplace,
Yeah, I felt that too. And I think for a lot of women, having to balance that with the caring responsibilities as well. So some people have lost work and or have been worried about losing work. Superannuation has gotten worse now. Yeah, others are saying that, looking after children at the same time as working has been really difficult during this time. Thanks to everyone who's been sharing. We might move on now to our panel of other young women speakers. So now we're going to hear from three amazing young women about their experiences of the impacts of COVID on employment. So again, don't forget to put any questions that you have for them in the Q&A, and we might get to them at the end. So our wonderful speakers tonight for the panel are Siu Tang Woon, usually goes by Tangy, Jamila Ahmadi, and Kate Mccauley. I'll introduce them a bit more as we go, but the first question I'm going to ask them all is, how has COVID impacted your working life? So that's kind of the question that I've already asked everyone to put in the chat. We might start with Tangy. So Siu Tang Woon is a 23-year-old Singaporean Chinese woman living in Adelaide on a 485 working visa. So she's currently working in the CBD at the Sky City Casino. Tangy is really passionate about making sure that workers on temporary visas are treated fairly. And so we know that a lot of, workers in hospitality, entertainment, accommodation have been hit particularly hard. Tangy, what happened for you this year when COVID hit?
Yeah, so I was only just got my visa this year, and then I started working at Sky City from January of 2020. So it was just a very, very recent employment. I haven't been there long, and I was working as a casual. So when COVID hit, I was not eligible for any JobKeeper, and job seeker because of my working visa. So things was, it was a bit challenging financially, and then I have to make the big decision of whether I should cancel my visa and fly back home and risk, in the future, if I apply for another visa, they would check back to my, visa history to see if there's any visa cancellation. If there was, that would make any future visa application really, really tricky. Or, stay and, hope that my finances will last me until everything goes back to normal and everything goes back to operational. So, and then as flights was cancelling as well, so I had a very, very, very small frame of time to decide what I had to do. So that was really, really stressful. But eventually Sky City Casino Adelaide did provided a hardship fund, which was pushed by our union to help those people who are left out of the JobKeeper and the job seeker. So that was really, really helpful to a lot of people that I know. So yeah, that was really good. But when I got stood down from Adelaide Casino, I had an existential crisis because, working in hospo, you're seeing thousands of people every day, and that's also like my social thing as well. So to not have that and to not have, going to work and getting my exercise and everything, it affected me not just financially, it affected me mentally as well, because that was my mental health thing. That was where I go to work happy, I interact with all my workmates and stuff like that. So it did really affect my mental health as well. So yeah, that's how COVID affected me. And a bit of a race thing as well, that I've noticed when COVID first started. Just walking on the street, you get stares from people, just because the virus originated from China, and obviously being Chinese, everyone just associate you with the same Chinese people all around. So I did get funny looks from people just from walking on the street as well. So people were being very skeptical and very, just like, well, maybe I should keep my distance kind of thing from me. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Tangi. And it's awful that, I think yesterday there was a new survey that the results got released showing that about a quarter of workers on temporary visas have suffered from racist verbal abuse since COVID started.
Yeah.
So definitely a huge problem, and makes things a lot harder when they're already hard enough.
Yeah, definitely.
But glad that you're back at work again.
Yeah, and I think working in hospo as a female as well, there's a lot of stereotypes. Like, we're just waitresses, that's it. We carry plates, we bring food to your table, and that's it. But I work behind the bar. I can pour a perfect pint of beer, I can do cocktails, I can do lots of things, and it's very rare to see a good female bartender, because we're not given the opportunity to, because being a bartender, you have to move kegs and stuff, which are really, really heavy. But then, women these days, we go to the gym, we lift 30 kilos of weight, and we squat 50 kilos of weights and stuff like that. So we are just as good as the men. We can lift, a carton of 24 bottles of wine in a box and all that stuff. So we're not afraid of hard work anymore. We're eating the same food as the men, so why should we be excluded out from male dominated industry as well? I'm not just speaking for a female dominated industry. We are just as good as them. So
Yeah,
I don't understand why we're not given the same opportunity or the same or more tools to help us be as good as them. you know, we're all equal, you know, we're all the same, we're all human, we all have flesh, muscles, bones, blood, and everything. So why should, you know, a female not be hired or not seen as preferable as to an employer? Sorry. Yeah, I know it's very, very challenging for us female, because we have, you know, lots of other commitments outside of work. Like some women want to have kids, some women, you know, have kids and, you know, going through pregnancy and maternity leave. So that is very, very tricky, because we have to have a certain working hours and we can't work long term because we have to go home to be primary caretakers. So I'm just really hoping that employers in the future would take that into consideration, like give more, you know, maybe be more understanding about why we can only work certain hours and work together to, you know, compromise, that kind of thing. Because I'm sure employers, you know, they have families, they have wives, they have kids as well, and they understand what their wives are going through. So if they understand what their wives are going through, why can't they understand with us as well? Because we're all mothers, right? We're all female, we're all mothers, we all have the same responsibility. So yeah, that's childcare, like even just a little childcare at your workplace would be great if they have the room, you know, especially if you're working for big companies who have just a little small office rooms where the parents can just put their kids there while they work in an office. That gives the mums, you know, a peace of mind to, you know, carry on with their work, and knowing that their company care so much about them and their kids and their family, they will put in more than 100%, 150% into their work, and that boosts productivity. So that's a win-win for everyone, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose speaking of kids, that might be a good opportunity for us to move on to Kate, who works with kids every day. So Kate Mccauley is an educator who's worked with 10 years experience in both primary and secondary schools. Most of her time's been spent in country schools. So she's currently in a leadership role within a primary school in the Barossa Valley. Kate's really active with the Australian Education Union and pushing for better conditions for education workers, the majority of whom are women. So Kate, teachers and other workers in schools have been working non-stop throughout COVID and have had to deal with a fair bit of uncertainty and extra pressure. How has COVID impacted your working life?
Yeah, thank you so much, Maddie, for having me on. I feel very, very privileged to be amongst such a great company, so thank you. So being an educator during COVID was really quite a complex role for us. I was very lucky, along with the majority of my colleagues, to maintain my job, because education is an essential industry, and you know, we still have to keep on teaching and educating our future generations. However, like I said before, it was not an easy job to have at the time. So being that there was actually a cluster of cases within the Barossa, my site actually got shut down towards the end of term 1. So in week 10 of term 1, we were actually shut down. So we then basically overnight had to go from full-on face-to-face teaching, and granted at that point we only had about a 30% attendance rate at our particular site, to complete 100% online learning for that week. And then the following week, which was supposed to be the last week of the term, ended up being 4 pupil-free days, meaning that teachers were still working and planning for online learning that was supposed to happen in term 2. However, we got notified a few days before the term started that, you know what, online learning is not needed, everybody. You're going back and you're going to be face-to-face teaching with your class. So then all of that work that we had done during that week and over the holiday period was then immediately made redundant. And so at that point, we had teachers who had not had a break during these term 1 holidays. And so by the time it got to the end of term 2, it was like we had worked about 25 weeks straight. And that is absolutely exhausting when you need to front up to these young students every day who you have got in your care. Being in a leadership role too, so my first priority during this time was my staff, to make sure that their well-being was looked after, because it's really quite a scary situation to be one day in a school and then the next day you are working from home and you're trying to give these kids some sort of learning via your online platforms that you've already got within your schools. And I mean, some sites didn't even have these online platforms that they were already using, so they were going right back and learning things from scratch and that sort of thing. In my experience and my colleagues' experience, it has been really difficult for women in particular to manage their workload and also manage their caring responsibilities at the same time. So friends of mine would be working from home, have their 2 kids or 3 kids or however many children that they've got at home, trying to then oversee their online learning and trying to facilitate their own class online learning at the same time. And then they might have a husband or a partner that's also at home working and that sort of thing. And then you've got to have, you know, 4 to 5 devices going on at the same time. And then where do you put everybody in your house? So there's lots and lots of complexities there. There were also vulnerable workers as well, so people who suffer from things like immune conditions, and those sorts of people were, you know, obviously wanted extended periods of working from home because of their particular conditions. So there was obviously COVID leave, but that only lasts a certain period of time, and if you want to have extended time working from home, then where does that leave you? So there was those sorts of complexities too. Then when we ended up going back to school, when our Barossa sites were reopened on the first Wednesday of term 2, then we experienced things like having lack of temporary relief teachers, because historically teachers go to school when they're still not well, because it's easier to go to work when you're not well than to write your reliefs and have somebody else be in charge of your class for that day. You feel better off in yourself going to work when you're not well than staying at home and wondering all day, oh, I wonder how my class is going and how this kid's going and how that kid's going and that sort of thing. So then, because there were teachers that were staying home because they had a sniffle or one little thing, because they couldn't actually go to work under COVID conditions, we now have this situation where there's lack of relief teachers to cover these teachers who are not in their normal classrooms, because everybody who's unwell is having time off, and so those people only go so far. And particularly in country areas, this can be quite a big issue, because already there's not a lot of temporary relief teachers around. The other cohort of people that I was actually quite concerned about when I was working from home was children who have suffered trauma and whom school is their safe place. And so for them not to be at school was putting them in danger. And so that was also really quite concerning, not just for me, but for lots of my work colleagues and lots of other educators that I know throughout the community. That was one of our major concerns, were these kids who have suffered trauma and who didn't really know what it was going to be like being at home for a time period that they didn't know how long it was going to last.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, so
really,
yeah, that's it. That's about it. Thank you.
Well, it's a lot. I think you've really emphasised, you know, how big that burden has been on a lot of women in those kind of essential work roles during this time. The caring burden, the having to manage that COVID risk, having to take risks, put yourself at risk, and balance that with caring responsibilities. So, might move on to Jamila now. So Jamila Ahmadi works for the Australian Migrant Resource Centre and has been involved in the settlement and humanitarian sector over the past 5 years in Australia. She has extensive background in developing and delivering services for people of refugee and migrant backgrounds. And Jamila is really passionate about empowering and motivating young people to realise their full potential. Jamila, what has the impact of COVID been for you and for the women in the migrant communities that you work with?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much again for this opportunity to speak with you all. It's a great round of panelists you have here, so it's a wonderful opportunity. Working as a frontline worker and also working within the field of refugee and migrant sector has no doubt been challenging. It has been personally challenging for me to work throughout this period. So during the period where there was a very short period in South Australia where we had the restrictions happen in place. So you were if you could work from home, and you could do that. However, the AMRC was open during this period because we found that it's important for us to open our doors because we have such vulnerable clients. And if we were to close these doors, then these vulnerable clients would have nowhere to go. And so how the COVID-19 has impacted migrant and refugee women, especially young women, is it's impacted them in the areas of employment, education. It's impacted them in terms of their mental health, in terms of feeling isolated, and also some of their past traumas, reliving some of their past traumas, because we have to understand that people who have come from refugee and migrant backgrounds, some of them have faced traumatic events in their life previously. And so being placed in a confined place such as home, that's basically them again reliving their traumas, or for example, them being in detention centers in the past or refugee camps. That is again reliving some of their traumas. And so this was one of the most challenging part for us to look at how we are going to solve some of these barriers and how we're going to overcome with these barriers for refugee and migrant background women. We also found that there was extra responsibilities placed on migrant and refugee women during this period. And so that's impacted them hugely in terms of their work life and also their home life. By that, I mean that for most refugee young women, they are one of the main caregivers of their family. By that, I mean they help and support their family members, not only their siblings, but also their parents. And some of these parents have a low level efficiency in English. So that makes it their responsibility to teach their siblings or their parents in terms of the English language or any other types of information that is COVID-19 related. And that, again, the communication all comes from this young person who bears all of the responsibilities of the family during this period. So of course, it's created a lot of emotional stress and, and as I said, isolation. But we've also seen some really great stories come out of this. And by that, I mean, we've seen these women be very resilient throughout this challenging period of their life. And we've also seen a community spirit, which has been fantastic to see. So communities would gather together online, support each other, young women especially. And also what we've seen is that where a community is in need of support or a social support system, they are always there for one another. And these are, I guess, some of the good case studies that I also want to share with you, not just looking at the negative impact, but also looking at two positive impacts of this. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, and especially that's really inspiring to hear how resilient young women have been and supportive of their communities. So I might move on to another question, which is I'll pose to all of you, which is, what do you think needs to change to make sure that young women have equal opportunities in the workforce? Tangi, I might start with you again.
So for me in hospitality, I think we feel very insecure. You know, especially if you work in bars and pubs, you know, sexual harassment is a very, very big thing, not only from customers, but it could also be your, you know, colleagues and your employer as well. You know, I have had an experience of sexual harassment at a workplace, and then from a customer, and then I told the employer about it, and they just brushed it off and be like, oh yeah, it's just our clientele, they just had a little bit too much, that's it, you know, just take it at like a pinch of salt. But the thing is, there's no excuse, you know, for sexual harassment, or even just to make a sexual joke. You know, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, that isn't harassment, you know, that kind of thing. So there needs to be some sort of protection for female in the hospitality industry. And also I think job security as well, because I am aware that a lot of females, after they go back to work from maternity leave, or they're like fired during their maternity leave, so that is very, very unfair, because they are taking what is theirs. Like the maternity leave is there for you to take. You can't take the maternity leave excuse to replace that employee with someone else who doesn't need a maternity leave, i.e. a male, you know. So that's the thing that needs to be changed, especially with hospitality. We have such high turnovers of staff and everything. Job security is a very, very big thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Kate? What do you think needs to change?
So for educators in particular, it was like the powers that be had forgotten that adults actually work in schools. Because schools are viewed as this like magical wonderland where COVID doesn't exist, because children don't transmit COVID and that sort of thing. And we now know from situations both here and interstate that that is not the case. So with that said, I think that we need more support for schools, so for sites in particular, and also employees, to maintain their working from home situation if they are considered to be a vulnerable person, and make sure that those people who are working from home, that their well-being is monitored, because as has already been mentioned, you know, working in isolation can be quite a daunting situation. But then as well as that, we need additional leave entitlements. So we need the paid pandemic leave, because, you know, as has been reported in the media and that sort of thing, like this is a 1 in 100 year event. So, you know, we need to put aside some of the things that are already in place and go, you know what, this is a once in a lifetime situation and we need to do something about this. And we also need assurance that our highly casualised workforce, not just in education, but in lots and lots of other areas, that they still have jobs that they can go to, and that they're not going to be unemployed purely because of the impact that this pandemic has had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've both now touched on, you know, how important job security is and having that protection to be able to take sick leave and leave when you need it. I'll hand over to Jamila. What do you think needs to change to make sure that young women have equal opportunities in the workforce?
I think, as we are all aware, there are certain barriers already in place for people of refugee and migrant background to even gain access to employment. So I think first of all and foremost of all, it's access to employment. Having the opportunity to have the right skills and training, and also ensuring that there is also a system in place for social support. By that, I mean it could either be family or social support. But I also think that it needs to change in the way that even within the workforces itself, that we need to encourage workforces to take in people of culturally and linguistically diverse in. They are an asset to the workforce. They will bring in new innovative ideas. They will bring in new business. And I think we should consider that all workplaces should consider having people from culturally and linguistically diverse, because they bring something unique into the workplaces and they are bringing new skills. And that's what, as we see, what Australia needs. And so that's probably the change that I would love to see in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my final question for all of you, a quick one, but so I think each one of you has really been working in different ways to create change and build better opportunities for other young women, which I personally find pretty inspiring. Is there a woman who inspires you and makes you think that change is possible? Again, Tangi?
I think that would be my mum, because my mum basically single-handedly raised me and my brother. At one point, she was working as an accountant, working as a freelance makeup artist, and also working at Macca's. So at one point, she was doing 3 jobs at once to raise us both. And she did a career switch when she was 40 years old, so it's not very common to see. It's a very big step, a crazy move, some people would say, but she's very, very successful in what she's doing now, and she's loving it. So she made it through, and she actually followed her dream, and now she's doing what she always loved. So that's very, very inspiring to me.
She sounds like an incredible woman. Thank you.
Oh, she is.
Kate?
For me, there are 2 really important women who inspire me. So the first one that I'll talk about really quickly is Jacinda Ardern. I look up to her immensely, and I know that there are lots and lots of women who do. To me, she is a wonderful leader. She's compassionate. She knows her people, and she speaks directly to them via things like social media and that sort of thing. She doesn't just give her public addresses. She actually goes out of her way to personally speak to the people who she's making decisions on behalf of. And she's also not afraid to make those hard and difficult decisions as well. And the other person who inspires me is a former teacher by the name of Gabby Stroud, who is also an author and has written 2 fantastic books. She has been a ray of light for the education sector during this time. She's also started an initiative for Victorian teachers to support them through their lockdown and that sort of thing. So they're the 2 people who inspire me the most to make change.
Thank you. Jamila?
Oh, that's a tough question. But I think generally most people who come through the doors of AMRC, especially young women or women in general, do inspire me. I mean, we've had in my community, but also at workplace, we've had many people of refugee and migrant background, women who've literally lost many of their close relatives or family members back in overseas over the last 6 months because of coronavirus. But they persevere and they're so resilient. They still, move on. They still are either, working or they're getting their education. Despite all the hardships they face every day, they wake up, they come to work, or they get their education, and they just want a better future, and that's it. Yeah, they inspire me every day, basically. Yeah.
Thank you, and it's really inspiring to hear all of you talk about the people that inspire you, I think, as well. So those are all the questions that I have for the panelists today. Before we wrap up, so some of you may know or might not know that this seminar is actually launching a project about young women and COVID. So the Working Women Centre is going to be running a project over the next year to try and ensure that young women are factored into the COVID recovery. And so this seminar webinar is an opportunity, I guess, to start that conversation happening. But we're trying to find out what the impact has been really broadly on young women, and then try and push for some of those solutions that you all talked about. And I personally am keen to take on board all those wonderful solutions you all four of you talked about as a bit of a manifesto and something to fight for. So I hope people watching will join us in that. And as part of this project, we are running a survey of young women to find out what the impacts have been, which I'm going to post in the chat and ask any young women in the audience to fill out. Just doing that now. So just popping that in there, and by filling that out, you'll be helping us to build a really broad picture of what that impact of COVID has felt like for young women. And it will also help us to figure out what needs to happen to make sure that we're not left out and left behind in the recovery. So I guess, yeah, it is time to wrap up, but I really want to thank all four of you for sharing both the knowledge that you have from your work, but also sharing, I guess, the personal side of what the impact of COVID has been for you as young women, and for having such great ideas about where to go from here. For everyone in the audience, we're going to be running more of these seminars, so please keep an eye out for the next one. Fill out the survey or send the survey to any young women that you know. We are also taking applications at the moment for volunteers as part of our Young Women's Advocacy Program, so consider applying. And thanks so much for being here. I think it's really, really important that we're having this conversation, because we all know that women the voices of women tend to be minimised or ignored. And so the first step to being heard is to talking. So I might end on I thought it would be fitting to end on a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg this week, which is that women belong in all places where decisions are being made. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.